Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz1st in Focus. Our topic of discussion today is poverty in Sri Lanka, and we have in the studio with us a very eminent guest. He is the Senior Professor and Chair of Sociology at the University of Colombo. He's also affiliated to RMIT University and Monash University in Australia. He's no stranger to controversy as well, I would say. Professor Siri Hettige, welcome to Biz1st in Focus. Thank you very much for taking time off and appearing on the show. I want to ask you straight off, in Sri Lanka, when we're dealing with poverty, what is it that we're doing right and where are we going wrong?
I think if we concentrate only on poverty based on whatever the poverty line, I think we are missing quite a large part of the story. I'm not saying that we do not have to measure poverty. I think poverty has to be measured both in absolute terms as well as in relative terms. I think our researchers have developed methodologies quite well in that regard, and I think we have no problem there. But I think we should concentrate more on income inequality and also expenditure, because it is really the relationship between income and expenditure that determines a great deal, not just poverty, but also quality of life and various other opportunities that the people deserve in terms of building up their futures.
Regionally, Sri Lanka has very high costs. I mean, if you compare Sri Lanka with other countries, with our neighbors, our fellow SAARC members, we have one of the highest costs for food, for example. Food is very expensive in Sri Lanka, partially because a lot of food that we consume is imported produce. Why is this the case in Sri Lanka? What is unique about our makeup that we're so reliant on, that we have such high food costs?
Well, I think we have to basically look at a whole range of issues to understand this situation. One is the labor issue. I mean, as you know, labor has been one of the most volatile things in this country. Ever since we liberalized the economy, wages started going up, and that is because people started moving around from urban to rural to urban, and then you also have people migrating to other countries. So, and as you all know, we have a very large proportion of our labor force employed in other countries, Middle East, and also nowadays a great deal of our workers go to the Middle East, to the East Asian countries. So the point is that labor cost has been going up across the board, particularly in rural areas, because when people are move out of rural areas from agriculture. So the point is that when the labor costs go up, the cost of production goes up and the prices go up, and agricultural commodities have been going up in price as a result, and also the amount of agricultural produce that we have from rural areas has also been stagnant, if not going down. And then of course, as you already mentioned, people have been moving away from certain sectors, particularly productive sectors, to other sectors of economic activity, like for instance the services have attracted much of our labor. As a result, we do not really concentrate too much on producing commodities in this country. We are basically producing services, and as a result the prices of commodities have been going up, partly because we have less and less commodities being produced in this country. I mean, look at industrial produce. We just consume almost anything under the sun, but still we don't produce very much in this country.
Professor, as an academic, is this an enigma or an anomaly for you? Because if we look at the development stories of a lot of developed countries in the world today who are moving towards more service-based economies, they've gone through that path where they've gone through the agricultural revolution, through the industrial revolution, their own industrial revolutions, and then to a revolution in services, so to speak. Do you think it is strange that a developing country in Sri Lanka has such a high focus on services as opposed to manufacturing?
No, we haven't really gone through the normal paces of economic development. It is true that agriculture has, attracted less and less labor in the developed countries like America. But the point is that in the United States, they have not really seen a decline in agricultural production. For instance, they produce a huge agricultural surplus with 3% of the labor force. So the point is they have not developed the other sectors at the expense of agriculture. And similarly, they have moved away from industry, conventional industries, because they started, importing cheaper industrial goods from other countries. But then at the same time, they have put so much money into research and development, and they could really go into various products which are very much needed in the services, like for instance telecom. And you can look at the giants in the high-tech sector in the United States. I mean, they just dominate. If you take the ICT sector, I mean, what are the countries that dominate the scene? I mean, you have Google, you have all these Microsoft and all these Apple and so on and so forth, and generating huge revenues, not just domestically but also globally. So the point is that you cannot compare the Sri Lankan story with the story of post-industrial societies like the United States and some of the European countries, and also even Japan.
What does our story tell you?
Our story is that we have, in Sinhala we say that Atuwa Kada Putu Hadwa. That is, we break, whatever the traditional assets we have, and then we have basically, gone into something that is really unreal. Which can, the point is that the economies sit on certain pillars, and of course the services sector is certainly one pillar. But then how about the other two pillars? You can't, have a let's say a situation where the economy has to just sit on one pillar. I mean, the services sector I think is important, but I think we have put too much emphasis on services at the expense of the productive sectors, and that is why you have this massive distortion, and that is why this very serious misallocation of labor and also of capital, and then of course nowadays land even.
Professor Hettige, one of the cornerstones of the Sustainable Development Goals that Sri Lanka and other countries have pledged to achieve by 2030, the UN Sustainable Development Goals they're called, is the eradication of extreme poverty. Does Sri Lanka have a problem when it comes to extreme poverty? For example, when you look at the number of people who are on Samruddhi benefits, does that indicate to you that Sri Lanka has a problem with extreme poverty?
Well, I think we have been able to reduce extreme poverty. We have been able to reduce we have been able to reduce even relative poverty, in the sense that you have a very small proportion of the population in extreme poverty. But the point is that poverty should not be measured only in terms of one indicator, i.e. the poverty line. You also have to look at other aspects of life. For instance, people need not just food. These days people want so many other things to have a decent life. For instance, education is very critical, and if education is expensive, then it's a pressure on families irrespective of their income. Same with health. I mean, health expenditure is going up irrespective of the fact that we boast about free health system in this country. And then similarly, transport is a nightmare, I would say, because people want to at least have a motorbike, if not a bigger vehicle. So the point is that that we have been basically not really taking care of other areas of other areas that are very important for people. And then housing, as you know, I mean, land prices have skyrocketed, and it is certainly not possible for an average person to think of really settling down in the Colombo metropolitan region. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if you just ask whether we have been able to reduce poverty, whether we have been able to address some of the present.
That's the wrong question.
I think that's the wrong question. I think what is important is inequality. And if you really look at the whole situation from the point of view of inequality, you have a very different picture. I mean, for instance, as I have told you before I started talking to you about this, certainly you have a situation where about 50% of the people not having enough income to be able to meet all the needs that they have to satisfy in order to have a decent existence. And then of course with the higher income group or the other end of the spectrum is quite different, where you have an income surplus. So I'm not unhappy about that. Actually, it's good to have an income surplus for everybody, because that is where your future depends, because your future prospects depends on your surplus. So if you have an income surplus, you might be able to buy assets, you might be able to invest in various other areas like children's education, and buy maybe life insurance, or maybe even these days buy even pension, and so on and so forth. So the point is that, but the fact of the matter is that less than about nearly 50% of households do not earn enough income. But then the question of course is whether we should really try and increase incomes. No, because when you look at the last 40 years, if you take, the situation is quite impressive, in the sense that our incomes have been going up and up and up. But the fact of the matter is that increasing incomes have not solved the problem. So the point is that the expenditure has been going up, and many people have not been able to keep up with the expenditure, as you rightly pointed out at the beginning. On that note,
Professor Hettige, I'd like to go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking about the household income and expenditure survey and solutions. If driving up incomes is not the solution, then what is? Biz First in Focus will be right back with Professor Sri Hettige. Welcome back to Biz First in Focus. We're in conversation with Professor Sri Hettige. We're discussing poverty in Sri Lanka and how to get Sri Lanka out of the lower middle income country trap. Professor Hettige, you mentioned during the first part of the show that driving up income is not the answer. You said that we should not be looking at poverty alone, but should be focusing instead on inequality. What is the answer for a country like Sri Lanka? Where should we be focusing our attention?
I think we need to really strike a balance between different sectors of the economy. You cannot develop one particular segment of the economy at the expense of the other segments. You see, I mean, we know that all countries need, agricultural commodities. There's no country which can really manage without, access to agricultural produce. So either you have to produce agricultural goods here in the country, or you have to import it. But I think for a country like Sri Lanka, there is absolutely no reason to import so much food, because we just have enough resources in the countryside, land and water and and other things that are required to produce enough food. And also it's not only food. Actually, in the rural sector we can also produce biomass, which can be very, very critical for moving away from non-biodegradable material to biodegradable material, to produce various household needs, like bags and containers and various things. And then of course industry, I think, is very important, because we are dependent so much on industrial goods for our day-to-day life, not just to maintain our standard of living, but also to have enough infrastructure around us to to really have, like for instance our schools, our hospitals, our transport systems, and so on and so forth. I mean, your media institution would not survive if not for various industrial goods that are being imported from other countries, you see, and so on. I mean, nowadays we depend so much on industry. And then of course the services are as important, because as you know, we need to really have our communication systems happening. We need various other inputs into our health system, transportation, telecommunication, power, and so on. So the point is that you have to have a balance. I'm not saying that all countries should have this balance between these sectors. Some countries would be more tilted towards agriculture, and others might be more tilted towards services, and so on and so forth. But I think given our situation in Sri Lanka, I think it is important that we try and strike a balance. And I think what we have done is to basically move away from productive sectors, and as a result we have a highly distorted economy, which is not sustainable. I mean, we need to really figure out how we are going to sustain various systems that we have now. Yeah.
On the subject of the household income and expenditure survey, there are people who question the validity of the HIES. For example, the World Bank, in a Q&A with a senior economist at the World Bank, David Newhouse, said that Sri Lanka's poverty line is calculated depending on data from 2002 and therefore relies on consumption patterns that existed in 2002. They point out that the country has changed a lot since then, and that poverty line needs to be updated at least once a decade. Do you see such problems in the household income and expenditure survey? Do you think that there is a problem in how we derive the data for the HIES?
As I already mentioned, I would look at income inequality much more than poverty. I think there is no question about the fact that we have reduced poverty over the years, and that is partly related to employment, because we have a very low level of unemployment in this country. I mean, there was a time when we had something like a quarter of our labor force unemployed, but whereas today unemployment rate is down to less than 5%. So that is a major factor. And then the other, of course, is the migration of labor, and we have nearly 1.5 million people employed abroad, and they are sending money back, and naturally the households are getting benefits out of these remittances to a very great extent now. So there are so many factors that have contributed to increasing household incomes. Professor
Ettinger, you mentioned the remittances coming from overseas workers. Now this is a very contentious point in Sri Lanka. The sending of our mothers and daughters and sisters to work as domestic aids in the Middle East has been equated by some to modern day slavery. Is this the case? Do you see it as being that? And how can we step aside from, move away from a culture where we are sending people overseas into potentially exploitative environments?
Well, I think in the initial stages of development, people tend to move out because you cannot really maintain higher wages, so that people are, encouraged to stay behind and work. But I think the main problem in Sri Lanka is that the need for high incomes, has been going up because of increasing cost of living and so on and so forth. So the people have been hard pressed to really find a way out so that they can have higher incomes. Now, for instance, as I already mentioned, we need to look at expenditure, as much as we look at income. Say, for instance, if you leave out food, you have 3 or 4 other major areas of expenditure which have been going up over time. Like, for instance, people spend so much money on children's education, and people spend so much money on health, irrespective of the fact that we have a free healthcare system. And then similarly, transport actually has been a major area of expenditure for households, and then also, as I already mentioned, housing. Now, all these things are areas where we can have effective policy interventions in order to reduce the burden on households. So, increasing incomes are, not very effective as a way of reducing poverty if you don't really do something about the expenditures. So, I mean, food expenditure has not been a major.
So, from what I'm gleaning from what you're saying is that at the end of the day, this all comes down to poor policy making.
Absolutely. I think in Sri Lanka, we have refused to, follow, time-tested, evidence-based policies. However much we academics have been arguing for it, we have an aversion to adopting evidence-based policies. But the point is that when you look around the world, you can see, that countries that have been guided by sound policies have done quite well. I mean, we really don't,
Those are the countries that our people are constantly trying to migrate to.
That's exactly the point. I mean, if you take, I lived in Australia for quite some time, when I was studying, and I know how attractive, Australia is. Not just because you can find employment and earn money. It's just because you have things around you. So on
that note, I have to go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking more about policy making in Sri Lanka and the country's development priorities. Welcome back to Biz in Focus. We are in conversation with Professor Siri Hettige. We're talking about poverty in Sri Lanka. In the last part of the program, we sort of identified weaknesses in policy making and relying on evidence-based policies. In Sri Lanka, we've been accused, or the public, we've seen accusations coming from the public, from academics, from the intelligentsia, that we have a process of siloed policy making. You some time ago devised a methodology for the division of and the distribution of ministerial portfolios, a scientific method it was touted as. However, implementation has been an issue. Why do you think that there is such, as you mentioned before, why is it in Sri Lanka that we have such a aversion to evidence-based policy?
I think it is a matter of ideology. As you know, we liberalized the economy in 1977, and thereafter the market forces have been basically having a very big impact on the way we manage our economy and also manage even our social sector areas like education and so on and so forth. But the point is that we really need to figure out how the state can really be a moderating influence on the way public affairs are managed. So it's not a question of either the market or the state, it is a question of both. But I think we have again, not been able to strike a balance between the market on the one hand and the state on the other hand. So the state's responsibility, I think, is to really come up with, sound policies based on evidence. Now I'll give you an example. Now taxation, I think, is a very important instrument that can address, lot of the issues that we have been talking about. For instance, if you take, the gap between, the income and expenditure, you see, you have to have, proper taxation policy, effective taxation policy. So, when you look at countries around the world, where you have, income equality, that is, a very high level of income equality, you have a very high rate of income tax. In other words, as your income...
The immediate example that springs to mind is Denmark.
Well, also countries like France, for instance, the highest rate of taxation, personal income taxation, there is 62%. So, but the point is that people immediately can see the difference. It's not only that they have a lot of the services, being provided, you also realize that there is equality, there is social justice, and so on and so forth. So you don't have this huge gap between the rich and the poor. You can see that. So I think so the point is that you have to adopt evidence-based policies. And then the other thing is, of course, what do you do about education, health, transport, and so on and so forth. Now we have not been able to really have a handle on many of these issues. Like for instance, transport I think is so critical, because it has wide ramifications. Like for instance, our environmental quality depends on the kind of transport system we have. Now like if you take Sri Lanka situation, I mean our public transport situation has worsened over time, but in fact it should have improved over time. This is a country where we inherited a network of railways. What have we done with that? Have you improved on that? I am ashamed when I see some of the trains that are being used, on our railway tracks, and like the neglect of railway infrastructure is scandalous actually. So the point is that you don't really attract the people with income to really use these trains. I know that in countries like Sweden, in Switzerland, in the UK, and so on and so forth.
Even in New Delhi right now.
No, yeah, absolutely. It is not just the poor people who use public transport. I mean, you have first class seats, on these trains. So the point is that you generate enough income to really pay for your service. It's not subsidized to the same extent as in some of the social democratic countries. But the fact of the matter is that you have to, and then the same with the health. Now we have not been able to really introduce a health insurance scheme that would really provide access to the best quality health care. Now for instance, we have a polarized health system today. We have on the one hand very nice private hospitals on the one hand. On the other hand, we have public hospitals which are not too bad, but at the same time not necessarily provide the best of the services that the people really need. So as a result, we have people moving away from public hospitals and spending money on consultants and also drugs and texts and so on and so forth. So the point is that we have to really try and strengthen these public services, health, education, transport, so that the people will not be forced to really spend too much money on these things. So the point is that when you put too much economic pressure, people run away, and that is what we have seen. And when people run away, you have a labor shortage. When there's a labor shortage, production cost goes up. And even if the production cost does not go up, you still have you don't have enough labor really. And also when people run away, especially the skilled people, you won't be able to really develop the economy, because you just don't have the expertise that you require to provide the necessary services to these sectors.
Professor Hettige, thank you very much for coming on Biz1st in Focus. It's been a pleasure. It's been an insightful and enlightening discussion. Some key takeaways from the program for our viewers as well. It's not just a problem of poverty, it's a problem of inequality. And as has been reiterated before on this program and by Professor Hettige on many an occasion, nothing short of evidence-based policy will bring the country towards progress and prosperity. I'm Nadim Majid. I'll see you again at the end of the week on Biz1st Review 360.